All right, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. I have a special episode for you tonight of a series that we started several months back on genealogy. And we did it with my father, who's our family genealogist, and with the expert he leans on very heavily, and that is Sally Cray, who was on that episode and did a great job. It was so large that we ended up having to split it into part one and part two. And we got so much acclaim from that episode. It was really exciting. I knew after that episode, very shortly thereafter, that we were going to have to come back to this topic around DNA research because it was clear to me we had not fully delved into that area. So how are you doing, Sally?
I'm doing great, Thomas. Doing great.
Welcome back.
Excited about tonight.
Really glad you rejoined us for this DNA research session tonight. Also with us tonight is a man, David Pope, who my dad has been in touch with for some time now to help him try to get through some of his brick walls on learning about the Pope family and figuring out who we're related to, whether we're related to the Nathaniel Pope line or the Quaker line, all kinds of different things we've been looking at with David. He's been a huge resource for us. He has the original Pope genealogy book, which all of us covet, and he's got the original copy. So how you doing, David?
I'm good, Thomas. It's so good to be here tonight with y'all. And it's just really an honor to be able to get together and talk about this. It's of interest to a lot of folks. And so hopefully maybe a couple of the people that are watching this podcast will be able to get some takeaways to make their research even better.
This slide is my favorite because when I'm fully retired and have unlimited wealth, this is where I want to travel because my true ancestry states that their site can take my DNA and tie it to archaeological digs. And all of these little spots represent archaeological digs where remains were found that match my DNA.
Wow, that's amazing.
So
Are you related to Julius Caesar? Because this looks like the Roman Empire.
to me, it's truly fascinating to know that even though I cannot possibly have the source documentation and the records to tie me to all of these sites, it does prove to me that all of those previous slides with all the different colorations, my ancestors really were in these areas. And there are skeletal remains that reflect DNA that is tied to me. So like when David was saying, we have that little snippet that stays with us over thousands of years, it really does.
Wow.
Now, was this person an uncle, a direct line ancestor? I'll never know. But for whatever circumstances their lives were, because of them, I get to be here.
Mhm.
That's very moving to me.
Truly an incredible picture.
Mm-hmm.
So in the future, when you go on this trip and you take lots of good footage, you'll have to come back on the podcast. This will be 5 or 10 years down the road, and come share it with us and show all the places you went to see your ancestors' locations.
You think about, for one that pops in my head is Pompeii. I don't think I have anybody that was at Pompeii, but someone did. Somebody's ancestor was in Pompeii at one point. Now, those people probably passed away there. I don't know of anybody that survived, but if they were out of town when the eruption took place, they have people that actually at one point in their lives lived in Pompeii.
Wow.
And when you put yourselves and your ancestors into history and make it real, that gives it a whole new value and importance.
Hey, David, have you ever traveled over to England, Scotland, Ireland to try to chase popes?
I have a little bit. And, one of the hard bits is that there are many more Americans who do DNA testing because we're looking for our story, looking for our roots. What we really need are some folks in these areas here to test so that we can match with them. So again, sort of like you're going to see in a couple of slides, there are a lot of different Pope families in England. And as a result, you really don't have a clue whether or not you're related to them or no.
True. Well, let's take a look at one of your case studies, David. Take us through
Yeah.
this one.
So again, I'm an amateur at this, but trying to solve some questions. And as I said, I reach out to folks that seem to have an interest in genealogy, even if they're not as much into it as I am. And this is a fellow that I know. His name is Jesse. He's a pope. That is the Mile High Swinging Bridge at Grandfather Mountain, and he works up there. Actually, is a leader up there. And so I reached out to Jesse and said, "Hey, do you know where your family's from, who you descend from?" His ancestors, to the extent that he can trace them, were back in Anson County, which is the county right beside Union County, which I'm from. And in fact, what is now Union County used to be part of Mecklenburg and part of Anson. So I thought, this has got to be somebody that I'm genetically connected to. So, hey, we're going to try to push the research out, see what the connection is. And he was willing to do DNA testing. And so if you'll flip on to the next slide.
So, by the way, Sally, this is one of the few Jessies that is in modern day.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So, here's the background though. Pope is not a very common name. It's not like Smith or Brown or Miller. But in North Carolina, this is a state that Pope is the most common. And you can see, Thomas, for your family, it's pretty common down in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia. So in North Carolina, it is fairly common. And so just because you share the same last name, and this is another thing I would really try to impress on folks who may be listening to this, just because you share the same last name with someone does not mean there's necessarily a connection. So anyway, if you'll go on to the next slide. So from doing this research, and Sally made this point earlier, it's really beneficial if you get connected with someone who's been researching a family in an area over decades. They'll have a general understanding of the families and who shows up where and that sort of thing. So from doing this work within North Carolina, these are the three major Pope families. And what you see here, this code, like this RS9342, the RBY16433, and then the IM253, think of those as sort of a code for a Y chromosome signature. So these don't match each other. It's a different Y chromosome. But from my research, I know that the I, this traces back to a man that we call William Pope the Quaker, just to differentiate him from all the other, hundreds of William Popes that are out there. The RS9342, this is a family that I'm actually part of, and all of my research points back to the earliest I can document them in terms of the shared lineages is in Sampson County, North Carolina. And so that's where my research is focused now. And then down here in the blue, and this is a really great point. So these families trace back to a common ancestor whose name was Heinrich Pabst, who was German, moved into North Carolina around modern day Hickory, Catawba County in the middle of the 18th century. And his name was anglicized because this was an English colony, even with German immigrants, to Henry Pope, because Pabst in German is Pope. And so, all three of us, these three lineages, share the same last name, but not connected with Y DNA matches. And if you go on to the next slide.
And we're pretty sure, David, that the red and the green definitely do not connect, because as you know, you and Sally have been able to help my father make sure that we now are under the William Pope the Quaker line.
Right. So yeah, you descend and your family descends from William Pope the Quaker.
Right.
That Y chromosome and my Y chromosome are very, very different. They do not match.
Okay. Got it.
And so what we found with Jesse's results, and this to me is one of the real benefits of doing the Y-DNA testing, if you're specifically looking for a paternal surname ancestry. So, quickly we got his results back. It matches your Y chromosome, and it descends from this earliest known immigrant ancestor, a man named William Pope. He was a member of the Quaker religion, and the earliest documentation we have of him is up in Southside Virginia, so Isle of Wight, Virginia. And you can see here on this map, so what I've outlined there, this is the original land transaction, land grant, where he was given a patent in 1656
Wow.
for 190 acres. So now this is not my family, but this is your family. And so, Thomas, you literally could drive up to around Smithfield, Virginia, and go down some country roads and, match this up with a modern map. You could stand on the property that your earliest Pope ancestor lived on, owned in 1656, which
That's
to me is
incredible.
really, really cool.
That's incredible. We need to do that.
Yeah.
Road trip.
Road trip.
What was neat about it in this case was, so Jesse was able to go back to the mid 1800s, but once we prove with the Y-DNA that this is the line he's from, then he can concentrate his documentary research, his record-based research on this family. And with a lot less work and a lot less false trails and rabbit trails, then Jesse was able to be able to trace all the way back with the documents to this man.
Amazing. So you're saying Jesse and my dad and I would be related, like he'd be our
Absolutely
distant cousin.
Yeah, you share a common paternal ancestor in this William Pope.
So you need to connect him with my dad so we can go visit with him.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
He's not far from your dad, right? Up in Asheville, he's at Grandfather Mountain. Absolutely.
We should definitely set that up.
That's a good road trip for you guys.
It is.
So this is sort of a second example from my own work. So this is an excerpt from the 1850 census for Union County, North Carolina. This is a household of popes that I descend from. So if you looked up at the top in yellow, Nancy Pope is the mother of this family.
Yes.
Her husband, whose name was Owen, died in 1850. So he died before the census was taken. So he doesn't show up here in the household. But in 1850, there was a mortality schedule that was also filled out. And in that it's listed, he's died, what he died from. And so I descend from a couple lines down this Owen, O-W-E-N, who was 8 years old in 1850 and a male. And then you'll see a couple more lines down, there's this name, and it's a little hard to read, but just from familiarity with the family and other records, the name is Seaburn. It's spelled here S-E-B-U-R-N. Again, spelling wasn't normalized at this point, so it shows up different ways, different places. But for many, many years, and this goes back to what Sally was commenting on about how once an error gets into a tree on ancestry, it propagates. So people looked at this and they made the assumption that Seaburn, who is 5 and 1 year younger than this name above it, which is Reddick, again, that's a name that's not unfamiliar in this area at this time period, but Reddick, who was 6, and they thought, okay, Nancy's the mom, and then these are all the kids: Sarah, Zilpha, Rebecca, Owen, Reddick, Seaburn, and then Jarcy is the final name. That's a girl. And so you would find in trees all across ancestry that Seaburn's mom and dad were Nancy Pope and Owen Pope. Well, if you look at these excerpts on the right side of the slide, this is from Seaburn's death certificate. So what you'll see down here where it says name of father, unknown, maiden name of mother, Sally Pope. So really what we have going on here in this census is not what it seems. So, Sally said, you have to make sure you look at this in context. So part of the context here is the names are listed in chronological order, oldest to youngest, not by relationship. So Seaburn here is actually the son of Sarah or Sally, that's a nickname for Sarah, Pope. And here in the death certificate, his father's name is listed as unknown, not given. The family, obviously, or probably Sally knew who Seaburn's father was, but maybe didn't share that with him or didn't share it with the family. And this was not uncommon at the time if you had children that were not born within a marriage.
For sure.
So this has been a mystery. This is a mystery that would date back at least to Seaburn's death, but probably within the community, right? To around 1845 when Seaburn was born. But if you go ahead and go forward to the next slide. So when we tested one of Seaburn's descendants, both Y testing and then the autosomal testing, the Y testing on the left of the slide shows that the closest matches were with men whose last name was Griffin. Griffin is a very common surname where I'm from. If you look at the autosomal matches, these are those cousin relationships, and you can see to the right of that excerpt, you see how it says shared DNA?
Yes.
7 centimorgans?
Yep.
Right, so that tells you the relationship, and we could go back to Sally's chart and look at what those connections would be. But those match many Griffins as well. And so what this tells me as I'm doing this research is there's a really, really good chance that Seaburn's biological father was someone who was a Griffin, a male who was a Griffin. And then we use that along with the context of the records. And if you'll flip to the next slide. So again, on the left, the 1850 census, this number to the far left that I've circled in red, 833, that is a house number or a family number. So 833, and again, Seaburn's 5 in 1850. So we're thinking about 5 years before that. So if you look at the page that precedes the one on the left, in household 828, there's a family and there's a male in it whose name is Lee Griffin. He's 27. 5 years before, he would have been 22. If you look a couple pages after this Pope entry in household 842, there's an Enoch Griffin. He was 65 in 1850, so 5 years before he would have been 60. If you look an additional page in household 853, there's a Thomas B. Griffin who was 31. So in 1845, he would have been 26. This doesn't tell us that one of these men definitively was the father of Seaburn. But what it tells us is that there were 3 males that would have been of an age to be able to be the biological father of Seaburn in close proximity. Because in the census records, particularly in rural areas, they were listed by the census taker by who was close as they took those records in.
So would you consider this like, Sally, when we look at ancestry, there's hints out there, and we know not to take hints as gospel, right? They're just hints. But would this be like hints that we could go follow up on and look at family search and try to connect?
Well, you wouldn't even have to switch systems. You could be on Family Search or Ancestry and look at these documents and think, well, this Enoch Griffin, he's 65. I wonder if he had more than just Lee and Thomas as sons. I would dive into the Griffin family, reconstruct it for the 1830s, 1840s, see if some of the Griffin boys possibly passed away, and maybe Sarah was dating Lee and Thomas's brother, and really branch out the Griffin family to see if there wasn't some kind of connection there.
Yeah.
You could even go as far as looking at newspaper articles to see if there's any newspapers in the area, to see if there was some sort of marriage license purchased, but maybe he was killed or something before they could actually get married, and she was already pregnant.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can go to the court record. So in North Carolina, at least at this time, if a woman was pregnant but not married, there would have to be a bond put up so that the child would not be the expense of the court. And so, you start looking for, were there any Griffins around this time period, 1845, that were brought into court for charges of, um, fathering a child? Was Sarah brought in to have to post one of these bonds? So,
Child support, something like that.
it helps to give you more
Mhm.
clues, whereas before we knew that Seburn's father was not biologically a pope, but you really had no clue.
Right.
Right.
Fascinating.
Something you could also do is possibly look at the wills. Maybe the Griffins knew that Seaburn really was a Griffin, and they bequeathed him something when they passed away.
Mhm.
Yeah, great.
There's a lot of avenues to really work.
True.
Again, it's that mystery.
Yeah.
It is. It's a big puzzle.
Mhm.
And then this is really sort of the final example that I would just use about how folks might encounter DNA testing. So when we talk about brick walls in genealogy, we're talking about this is how far back we've gotten to be able to document, and we really at that point are stuck that we're not able to say with any certainty who the father or the mother was. And so my brick wall on my Pope side is a man named Joshua Pope. And this is an excerpt from the 1800 census for Sampson County in North Carolina. And you can see here that Joshua Pope is listed right before a man named Jonathan Pope. If there was more of the census record available here that I was showing you, you'd also see that both of these men are in the same relatively young adult age range. They both have young families, they're married. So based on that, it isn't likely that it's father and son. It's more likely that because they're about the same age, it could be brothers, it could be first cousins, it could be second cousins. And so, trying to figure out what is the connection, are these men connected, and how do they relate to each other? So if you'll go to the next slide.
And no DNA is going to help you with that, or would
Well,
the
it
Y,
will.
would the Y DNA maybe
Yeah,
help?
I'm going to show you how the DNA helps to get through the brick wall. So these are results of testers that have tested their Y DNA with family tree DNA. And what you'll see here is I've circled in red all of the testers that I know descend from Joshua. And I've circled in green all the testers that I know that descend from Jonathan based on the paper records. And what you'll see is, and it's a little hard to make out, but as we work up, then they start sharing more and more of these codes together. And each of those individual codes is a mutation on the Y chromosome. And so you'll see there at the top of this picture, it sort of goes under this broad blue block that is FT194245. So what that tells you is that they each have some mutations as they've developed over time, but they ultimately descend from the same paternal ancestor. So what this answers is, yeah, they absolutely are genetically related because their descendants and match each other. And then the other thing you'll notice is that there are some names in the middle of the screen, and these names don't have a circle around them at all. And so if you flip forward, I've just highlighted that fact. And so then the question is, okay, where do these folks come from? And that's where you start trying to do the research from the documents there. And if you'll flip forward one more, when you look at those two particular testers and their shared ancestor, it's a man whose name, again, William Pope, super common name, William, but he's found in the 1810 census in St. Peter's Parish. This is an Anglican parish that is now modern day Jasper and Hampton County, South Carolina. So right down on the border with Georgia, near Savannah. And you'll see that he's here. So this William Pope is listed there. So again, we don't know exactly at this point what the connection is between this man, Joshua, and Jonathan, but we do know that they share this common paternal ancestor. And what we also know, if you'll go back one slide, is that the connection between Bruce Pope and another Jesse Pope. So this is not the Jesse we talked about before. This is a Jesse who's in South Carolina, but they are more closely related to my Joshua line of popes than they are to the Jonathan. And so again, this is, in the abstract, it is a little confusing, but when you start putting it together, it helps us, along with the records, to be able to solve these mysteries as we move forward. So if you go forward 2 slides, this shows you geographically where the families were. So 1815, that first dot on the border between North and South Carolina, that's the area that my ancestors settled in. 1810 is where Jonathan immigrated to 1814 in Georgia is where Jonathan immigrated to. And then 1810 is where William, who was in South Carolina, was at. These families all seem to trace back to Sampson County, and the earliest we find popes there are 1761. And then if we look even closer up towards the Virginia line, which is where these families started out, in 1721, Thomas, we find your Pope Y-DNA family in Halifax County.
Mm-hmm.
And then who I believe to be the ancestor of my popes is found there making a will in 1760. And so now, the mystery really is there a connection? We know it is not on the Y chromosome, but is there a connection with these 2 Pope families? And could it be the sort of connection like we just found with the family of popes that descend from Seaburn Pope and the family of popes that are from his grandfather's family, my line? And so if you go forward one more slide.
So now, David, you have everyone on the edge of their seat. Are you and I cousins or not? That's the question.
That's what we're trying to figure out. Here's why I think it may very well be possible, Thomas. So this is a picture of my grandfather when he was a young man. You can see based on this red dot, that's his Y DNA. And these 4 men that are listed here, they're the same DNA, the IM253 that you have, that your dad has.
Mm-hmm.
But these 4 men are autosomal matches with my grandfather. And what you'll see down here is that at the bottom, this Jesse Barry Pope Jr., that's the Jesse that we referenced in the first slide. And so again, we know that these men descend from William Pope the Quaker, and my grandfather on the Y chromosome does not, but he has this connection. Now, this is where we try to disprove the connection instead of just assuming it. And so if I go back 5 or 6 generations, which is as far as the autosomal DNA is really reliable to test and to be able to predict, the names that I find on the family trees of James Barna Pope and Jeff Hoyle Pope and Glenn Pope and Jesse Pope are not the same names that I find in my grandfather's pedigree. And so, again, this is something where we don't want to jump to a conclusion, but I think it's very possible that in the 18th century, one of these Pope men had a daughter that may have had a son out of wedlock, which would, if he took her name, just like Seaburn, might result in there being this autosomal match and connection, but the Y DNA not matching. So again, at this point, that's a hypothesis. It's a working hypothesis, but this is how the DNA testing, along with the records, is helping me to try to solve this big mystery about, where does my family originate prior to Joshua Pope?
And do they relate to William the Quaker or not?
Yeah, that's part of it.
And do you think that mtDNA might show that?
No, because again, the mtDNA in this case is only going just mother to child to child.
I gotcha.
So it doesn't
Okay.
really help me in terms of this.
Okay. Gotcha. Would 11 centimorgans of shared DNA be enough to make you suspicious that there's a connection there, or is that too little?
It makes me suspicious because Jesse is several additional generations removed from the generation that my grandfather is. So
Okay.
to find a connection between my grandfather and Jesse, again, you try to work on disproving your theory. But as I work back through, even though Jesse's family is from Anson County, which is very close to Union, as I work back through his family, I'm not finding other family relationships that would account for this shared DNA. And so that makes me think it's something to follow through.
Absolutely. Your
You know,
grandfather,
go ahead.
your grandfather was a good-looking guy.
He was a good looking guy, a lot better than me.
I don't know about that.
One point that I would make here, and this is something else I would impress to the folks that may be watching this. Autosomal DNA, like we saw on the slide, every generation, only 50% of the parent is being transmitted to the child. And so there really is an obligation and impetus. You need to be testing the oldest members of your family that are willing to test, because there are matches that my grandfather's kit has. Even though I tested with this exact same company, I don't show up as a match to these men, because between my grandfather's generation and then his DNA being halved and then halved again from my father to me, what happens is, right, even if I did have some shared DNA with Jesse, by the time it divides, so let's say 11 to 5.5, 5.5 to 2.5, it's too small to be picked up. So really testing the oldest folks in your family that are willing to test is crucial for
So
getting the
next time they go see grandma and grandpa, whether they're at their own home or at a retirement home, get them to agree to a test.
I
So you know
I
the data.
routinely I will order kits and I will bring them to family gatherings, and I will explain what I'm doing, and I will say, I'm trying to solve this mystery. Would you be willing to, rub this cotton Q-tip looking thing on the inside of your cheek so that I can try to solve this mystery?
That's
And
great.
again, I find that people are usually very generous in sharing this because they have an interest in the mystery being solved too.
Fascinating. So, Sally, is this kind of how you see other families trying to solve these types of brick wall mysteries? You
Absolutely,
see a lot of
absolutely. The DNA is going to support and expand any kind of research that we have in paper documents.
Mhm.
And much like what David's doing, looking at the subsidiary families that are feeding into and supporting the Pope families, looking at those surnames and filling in those parts of the tree, you can see if there's any kind of source records that they're going to have
Mhm.
to substantiate the person that you're truly hunting down.
Interesting.
It's interesting when you look at the wills and even the inventories when people's property is being sold. If you're looking for Seaburn Pope, you might be able to find him listed there. And so if Seaburn Pope was purchasing some of the farm equipment from Enoch Griffin's
Yeah.
estate sale, that means that he may have known that that was his grandfather. It's those
Yeah.
type of things that the slightest little clue can
Right.
be the most important thing that you find all day.
Well, David, if you're able to make the connection, or if we're able to help you do so, we'll have a huge celebration and family reunion, and I'll bring the champagne.
Absolutely.
We'll have a
So,
great time.
I claim you, Thomas, you and your dad, even if we aren't genetically related.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely. So, working with local groups, talk to me a little bit about this one. What are some groups they can get involved in?
Well, we've talked about some of the DNA groups. When you're looking for a specific surname, a specific family, hunt those families out and join and help those groups. The wealth of information that you can find in your the societies that are down the street from you in your area, your state societies, topical societies, even if it's something as general as just a DNA society. Join those societies and learn how your DNA can really have an impact on not only your research, but other people's research. And historical societies, that map where you had pinpointed all of the documents, the years that the popes
Mhm.
were in those areas. Understand the historical significance of those areas where your ancestors lived. Know when the county names changed. You know, our nation wasn't instantly geographically defined by states and counties and townships. And look at those plat maps and see where your ancestors were granted land or where they purchased their first land from those original land grants, and understand the history and what our ancestors went through to really capture a good understanding of why some things happened the way they did, who their neighbors were, much like the Griffins, and understand that those people did what they did to survive and allow us to exist.
Well, I also mentioned, Sally, that Ancestry.com has local meetups in big cities. I know they have them here in Charlotte.
Right.
And also, there's meetup groups. If you go to meetup.com, there's meetup groups that get together that love genealogy, and they sit and talk and have lunch, and they go over the kind of research they're doing at the time. So, if you guys are really interested in it, definitely get involved in your local groups that love this type of stuff. So, good stuff.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about something David and Sally and I wanted to do, which was to leave you guys at the end of the program with 10 steps of how to get started on your family history. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that. The first one is to determine a target ancestor. Now, I know, Sally and David, you don't always have to start that way, but certainly that is a nice thing to start with. Let's say you want to try to target your great grandfather, your great great grandfather, or great great grandmother. It could be helpful to kind of have a target person. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. But it doesn't have to necessarily be an ancestor. Any target.
Okay.
You know, don't sit down at your computer or go to your library and say, "Hey, I'm going to find out about my family." Get a focus, because you're going to have wins along the way with that focus. And
Mhm.
once you make some good accomplishments, then you can expand your focus or change your focus.
Mhm.
So that target doesn't have to be a specific person, because maybe you haven't found that person yet.
That's a good point. Very good point. So next one is get your DNA samples in place. I assume both of you agree it should be autosomal at first, especially if you're an amateur.
Right.
Go ahead and get your DNA samples. And then after that, you want to review what records and information about you that the ancestor you have already, about that target you're looking for. So if you have any records, you have any newspaper articles or old photo albums or any kind of written notes that have been taken by previous generations, definitely do that as much as possible and kind of gather it into a file. Any other comments on that one?
I think a lot of us have some records that we don't even realize are valuable. Sometimes you have to read a document a couple times to get all the clues. Death certificates are the perfect example. You look at the big ones, big information points, the birth, the death, who their parents were. Sometimes you need to consider listing out everything that your ancestors passed away from.
Even a
It
high school
sounds a bit
yearbook.
morbid,
Mhm.
but if they have some pre-existing conditions that genetically have been passed down to you, that's important to know.
Right.
Another thing is who the informant was on the death certificate. Then you want to look and see if they're really buried in that cemetery that's listed on the death certificate. We find that sometimes the cemetery that's listed on the death certificate has either had a name change, or if you need to look at an obituary and find the alternative cemetery that they were buried in, you'll find that sometimes they don't match.
And it's amazing. You mentioned in the last podcast they have these great resources now where you can look at headstones online.
Yes,
You don't
yes.
actually have to go there. You can actually look at it online. So
Find a Grave and a couple other
Find a Grave.
websites
Right.
list those out for us.
That's great. Also, high school yearbooks. I know we discovered my grandfather's high school yearbook after he passed away.
Yes.
What a great find.
Mhm. Interesting pictures that you may have never seen.
That's right. That's right. So number 3 is start your research notes from the beginning and start a folder. Stay organized. I don't know how you guys keep track of all the documents you guys go through, but it must be some kind of organization that you have to do at the beginning, correct?
It certainly is. And the more organized you are, the less number of times you go down the same rabbit hole.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know, if you're looking for further information, sometimes that rabbit hole is the right one. But if you've already been down that rabbit hole and it's the wrong Jesse Pope or whatever it is, you want to make sure that you've made some kind of notation that you
Yeah.
don't go back down to the wrong avenue again.
Mhm.
I didn't bring it with me to this computer, but I have a notebook that I keep just for this particular family. And Sally is so right. You need to write notes to yourself that says, I've looked at all of the census records from whatever 1790 to 1850 for this county. No popes listed in any of these records.
Mhm.
Because again, for me at least, I'm doing this as a hobby. I do it when I have free time, which isn't always a lot. Um, I may come back to an ancestor or a particular focus a year or 2 years later. And so, like Sally's saying, instead of spending so much time and then you get halfway through something and you go, oh, yeah, I remember this. I've looked through this. Make sure you keep good notes so that you can be effective and efficient.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very good. What about all those documents you were just showing us in previous slides, David? How do you keep those? Do you keep them on your computer? Do you keep physical copies of those, like old
So,
court records?
sometimes both. So now I've got several folders on my computer that I pull those into, the things that are important, and then give them a name that's really easy to, 1850 Union County Census Popes or something.
Okay, got it.
And I still have lots of manila folders where I was doing this when it was mainly still just paper.
And I guess, Sally, for you, you probably have a folder that starts with your client name, right? And then drills down from there on the different searches you're doing for them, maybe?
Exactly, exactly. I keep a
Got it.
lot of Google Docs and pull images, place on the Google Doc, and you can organize it any way that's comfortable and makes sense to you, but usually it's by surname.
So you must have a pretty large Pope folder by now,
I do.
I bet. So number 4 is start review with hints on ancestry.com or other platforms. So I know, Sally, you had a lot of cautionary tales about using hints, but obviously they're important, but you can't completely rely on them, correct?
Yes, and the hints are clues. And with the popes, you want to make sure you have the right pope. You want to take that hint, and if it's a little snippet, you want to find where that snippet came from and look at the page before and the page after, because things get taken out of context, and they're not a good hint if you cannot find the source. And
Mhm.
sometimes those sources on Ancestry don't have, or excuse me, sometimes the hints don't have a source. They're simply an image or
Got
a
it.
picture. There's a picture of one of my great great grandfathers, and I tracked down the original poster of the picture, and I said, where did this picture of great grandfather Hendrik come from? And I've never heard back.
Mm.
So I don't know if I can trust that picture. You need to be able to trust where you're finding your information.
Interesting. Yeah, and also those hints can sometimes put you down the wrong rabbit hole, and it's happened to my dad a bunch of times. So
Yeah.
just a cautionary tale.
Mhm.
Number 5 is evaluate what is missing. So any
Yes.
recommendations on that and kind of figuring out, do you have like a checklist or like a template you work from?
Well, when I find something that's missing, I look at alternative places to find it. So
Yeah.
many times you'll find, especially on the East Coast, there are repositories that you can access, whether it be in a specific state, different library systems, JSTOR, Google Books, that are going to be additional avenues beyond the traditional companies, Family Search and Ancestry.
Mhm.
So don't feel that if Family Search doesn't have a record, it doesn't exist.
There's still things that haven't been digitized. And so it may be, in an LDS research center, but
Right.
it may not be something that's online with Family Search.
No question.
Correct.
And, and the other point that I would make too is when you get really focused onto a particular record, I still think there's a benefit of, if it's feasible, to be able to go and look at the original. So about once a year, I'll go to Raleigh. I take a trip here to where our state archives are and look at the original copies of the wills because there are some things that look better in person than they do in the scanned copy.
Have you
Um,
discovered things doing that where you were really surprised, like, and you were so glad that you went and saw the original? And
well,
his,
yeah, I mean, I'll give you one good example that isn't always obvious. So, if you're looking at handwriting and particularly whether something's a copy or something's original, we have lots of scanned images that are available for North Carolina on Ancestry that are copies or sometimes copies of wills. They'll be in will books.
Mhm.
And so, names often the person transcribing doesn't know the real name. I
Mhm.
point this out on
Right.
my Facebook Pope genealogy page, where the name that was transcribed in the transcription was Lawrence, but the name that's in the original document is Thomas. And so again, I
Yeah.
was familiar with the family. I knew I had never come across a Lawrence. And so just the fact that it was an odd first name sent me back to the original. And when you look at the original handwriting of the will, you can see how somebody would misread that for the other name. But
Mhm.
that's something if you weren't willing to be absolutely sure and go back to the original document, then we'd be wondering where this Lawrence Pope fell out of the sky.
Right. And also, everyone used script back then, and the script sometimes was really hard to read.
Yeah,
So,
it
Right.
can be.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's very good. Don't always trust the transcription
that's
of a
right.
document. Look at the document itself.
Exactly right. So, number 6 is search in 3 ways: name, place, and time period. And I know about name, I know about time period, but tell me about place. Like, I'm not quite sure what the recommendation there is.
Well, I think it's important to know the history of the place that you're searching. Much like how we talked about the name of a county and the square miles of the county. Those have evolved over time. So what might be held in one county may not be what it was called at the time of your ancestors' existence in that area. So if the county has been split in two, you're going to want to look to see where the records are being held for the time period that your ancestor was there.
Got it. Very good.
And hopefully those records haven't been destroyed in, some sort of fire
Right.
or lost in a transition.
David mentioned the courthouse fires, of which there were many, unfortunately. We lost a
Mhm.
lot of good stuff. Create a research plan, number 7.
Yes.
So
It,
is that
that goes
something
that
like,
goes along with having a target. Have a goal that you want to to achieve before you tackle another target, and be able to document along that plan and make a, if you are going to take a trip to Raleigh or wherever you're going to go, plan that trip, call ahead, ask the librarian if they need to pull the records that you need before you get there, or even the courthouse. And that's going to save time for them and for you, and kind of maximize your visit.
My dad's wife, Julie, complains that he does this type of work 12 hours a day and that he needs to find another hobby. But one of the reasons he does is because every time he finds another rabbit hole, he'll spend the whole day on that new rabbit hole and then realize by the end of the day that he hasn't achieved the original plan that he was working on. So it is good to kind of really stay focused on your objective and your target so that you don't get off track. So yeah, I know he definitely would attest to that. So transcribing documents, how much do you guys do of that?
I do a fair amount of that with land transactions. There's a cliche that says follow the land, particularly for families that have been in an area for a long time. And so I've done that with pretty good success, because you see the same meets and bounds description. That's, this distance to this tree, then this distance to the creek. You see the same descriptions over time. And so you can get a sense of what's going on. But if you're just staring at these very old script written land grants or land transactions, it can get overwhelming. So that's something that I've done quite a bit.
I have as well. And
Mm-hmm.
like David said, you don't want to look at the script. You want to look at it in a type font that you can
Right.
read easily and
Right.
understand. So it makes the job easier to sit there and transcribe it. And then what I like to do is make a list of everyone's name that is mentioned, because if it's a will, or even if it's something to do with land, so many times they'll list the name of the neighbors because those, abuts the property of so and so. And so that's an important name to note, because the next time that land is transferred to someone else, it's going to abut the same person or whoever they sold the land to.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and I would think that you're going to be referring to these documents a lot. So the transcribed version of it's going to be a lot easier to read, especially when you're in a hurry or trying to find something quickly.
At the risk of being really obtuse, Thomas, when the first time you get into doing this sort of research, it is like going to a Brazilian steakhouse where, everybody's walking around and you're just taking a little bit of everything. But having this research plan, having the focus keeps you disciplined, so that when you walk in, you don't get pulled off into this way and the other. And you realize, the most important thing for me to figure out next is this piece of information. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And when you do that, then it tends to be sort of higher quality work. And then when you are ready, and this is why taking the time to transcribe a document, when you're ready to move on to the next step, you have created another solid level in this work you're doing. So you don't, if it isn't solid, if it isn't a good foundation and you're building on that, it crumbles, and you get, years down the road and realize you should have done it right the first time.
Makes so much sense. So number 9 is speak to family and friends and neighbors. And we talked about this a little earlier in the podcast, to really do interviews of as many people as you can who might have known the people you're searching for.
Right. And when you're looking at these old records, obviously you can't speak to these people anymore, but you also want to make note of the friends and family that you find documented along with your ancestors, because those folks are going to have records as well. And that may colorize not only your ancestors' lives, but give you additional clues or items that make things have some clarity for you. Much like, Enoch's Griffin's will. If he had bequeathed something to Seaburn, we would have known instantly that he was truly a Griffin.
Yeah.
For sure.
I'll tell you, even, like you're saying, in terms of humanizing these folks, it was through talking with some of the descendants of Seaburn Pope that they were saying, yeah, what I remember is they always called him Sebe. And so that's how I know what the pronunciation of this man's name is, because it just as easily could have been Severn.
Right.
But
Right.
then,
Steve. Yeah.
but this was passed down in the family that knew that, and it makes sense because then when you see transcriptions, sometimes the name is spelled Cebern, right?
Phonetically again.
Yeah, that's right, phonetically. And so knowing now, okay, in the family he was called Sebe, he was called Seaburn. Now when I'm looking through documents, even names that might not seem like this is it, you're like, oh yeah, that's it. So I mean, and that's the sort of thing that if this gentleman that I was talking with, who was a descendant, was in his 80s, and so if he had passed away, then that's a piece of information that would have been lost forever, just as if, things get burned up in a courthouse fire.
Fascinating. So the last one is set up a new tree if necessary and search related member trees. And I know both of you have done this before. Dad's set up several of them, but Sally, maybe tell us a little bit about this tree you just set up around DNA.
Well, your father was very curious about his DNA matches and was not understanding how, of course, nobody in the 1800s could take a DNA test. So how could he be a DNA match to somebody that was from the 1800s? So what I did was I took your father's tree and replicated that and placed in all of his DNA matches. I can't say all, but quite a few of his DNA matches. So where your dad likes to have the ancestors in a straight line without any aunts and uncles and cousins, this necessitated adding everyone's aunts and uncles and cousins. And then I could take and put in his DNA matches. And every time there was a new line, I put that in all caps. So when you look at the tree, you'll see the all cap lines are DNA matches lines that tie to the same shared ancestor that you descend from.
But that he hasn't done the research on yet.
Correct.
Because they're new. Yeah. Okay.
And so he won't need to do any research on these folks because these lines support his ancestors.
Got it. Makes sense.
So I'm excited for him to call me, and we'll go over that tree together, and we'll get you in on the call and explain how these
please do.
cousins actually are related to him and
Please do,
you.
because I looked at it Sunday night for the first time, and it was fantastic, but I was a little overwhelming compared to the regular tree. So I look forward to that conversation. Any comments, David, on number 10?
I tend to do this, again, if I'm trying to identify someone that may or may not be a connection. So like when I first reached out to your dad, if he hadn't already had a tree where he had done the work, then I would go ahead and create in my Ancestry account a new tree specific to this person that I'm tracing back, just to keep it clean, so that I'm not, making a connection on my tree that may not actually exist.
Makes sense. Really good.
And each line doesn't need to have an additional new search tree. You can have a tree that is basically your research tree, separate from your good tried and true tree. So you can put those people in there and put the source documents in and your notes and use that as a working document. And then not until you're sure that they belong in your good tree, then you can move them over. But use those ancestry trees as good tools to help organize your research too. And if you find that they don't belong in your tree, I'd leave them there because they're just in your research tree. You
Mhm.
don't want to delete that work that you did, because in another couple of years, you might forget that you researched that line and found it wrong and do it all over again.
Yeah.
Very good point. Yep. Very good point. Well, hopefully this 10-step checklist helps all of you guys who are watching tonight get started on your family history. We wanted to really leave you guys with a leave behind so you guys can get started, and drop us a comment if you guys have had some success or if you have any questions about that for us. So, David, you had a couple books that you recommended here.
For a layman like myself, these are really good resources. The one on the right specifically about why DNA testing, if you're focused on your paternal ancestry, and the one on the left I found was really just sort of good as a general, reference work.
Yeah, it's great. I now have 2 more books I need to read. I look forward to it, especially that one on the left there. That really looks fascinating. I'm looking forward to it. All right. Well, Sally, tell everybody how they can get in contact with you if they want your assistance or want to ask you some questions.
Check out my website, shoot me an email. It, it's something that I'm committed to. I think everyone is entitled to know their ancestry. And once you find out your ancestry, I think so many things fall in place for you. You understand where you are, why you are, and where you come from. And I think it's very powerful. Um, Knowledge is a fabulous thing, and it sometimes isn't tangible. I joke that, nobody's going to get a crown and with jewels, but it's that knowledge of who walked the face of the earth before you and enabled you to exist.
Yeah.
So reach
Absolutely.
out to me if you have questions.
Definitely do. Sally is the absolute best. We've really
Thank
loved
you.
working with you, Sally. Thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
a second time, by the way, tonight. David, tell us how they can get in touch with you.
Sure. So this is my contact information. Again, I'm an amateur, so if you need somebody to help you, go to Sally. But if you happen to be out there and you're researching families in Union County, North Carolina, or Sampson County, North Carolina, or Pope family, or a family that connects with the Popes, y- you know, my offer would be I am happy to try to share the research I've done to make yours a little more effective and efficient, and to be able to keep you from going down some of the side trails. I have sort of a general Facebook site, so Pope Genealogy. It's got some information. I try to update it every now and then. But this is a way when I come across new information related to my own research with the popes, I'll share that. It's got some general information about the Pope's surname. And then the final link down here, this is the Pope Y-DNA research group that is part of Family Tree DNA. And so there's some information on there that you can look at if you decide that you are interested in doing Y-DNA testing for the popes. Then you can join this group. It gets you a little bit of a discount from the test with Family Tree DNA, and it helps to pull your information in with everybody else's so that that can be sorted into families based on the matches.
And I will drop all of this information for both you guys in the comments and description down below. So everybody can get in touch with you guys.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. So, Sally, final thoughts. What a fantastic episode talking about DNA and talking about our genealogy and our family histories.
Final thoughts. Um, don't be afraid to submit your DNA. You can make the results private, and understand that if you're looking for somebody, they're not there yet. Sometimes it's really nice to be the first one there for someone else to match to. Um, Not everything's going to be instant. And if you think that you're finding something that might be a shock to a lot of people, make a printout of all your DNA matches, then place your DNA as private so you don't show up for them anymore, and contact somebody, maybe me, and we'll work through those DNA matches and see if there isn't a surprise in your DNA results.
Fantastic advice. Thank you, Sally. David?
So here's my plea. There have been many, many times that I've thought if I could go back in time, I would wring my ancestors' necks for not writing down who their parents were and who their kids were and passing that on generation by generation. But on the flip side, the folks that lived 100 years ago, your grandfather, Thomas, that did all this work, if he knew that there was a test that you could take that was a spit test or cheek swab that would tell you definitively you either are or are not related to Nathaniel Pope, who was a great grandfather of George Washington, he would kick you for not taking that test and answering that question. And so, it's sort of a fair trade-off. So I think we need to be good stewards of the technology and the tools that exist now. And even if you're somebody that is a little into genealogy, but not a whole lot, usually I find that there's one person within a family that is sort of the one that's leading the charge. But
Right.
everybody else is, if they'll write down their information, share what they know, and be willing to participate in the DNA testing, then we can make a lot of headway. And, my hope is, quite honestly, Thomas, by the time that you and I pass away, that a lot of these mysteries that still exist will be solved.
I completely agree. My grandfather, by the way, would have been so excited that this technology exists, but he also, I think, would have been a little frustrated. Why did I spend 35 years driving around to little courthouses in Virginia? But anyway, it was part of the journey. So, well, I cannot thank both of you as so much as participating in tonight. And this has been an incredible, incredible program. I know people are really going to benefit from it. Really, thank you so much, Sally and David.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
And,
thank
and when you guys have a big breakthrough, you'll just have to come back and just tell us all about it. So
Will do.
thank you guys so much for being on Traveling Through History.
Good night.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.